see it, but I know you're there. So back in the 70s and 80s, back in the days of Hill Street Blues, the Thompson newspaper chain used to have a practice of sending their new reporters up to the town of Timmins for their first reporting job. And in the late 70s, one of those new reporters, these were usually kids right out of journalism school, one of those new reporters was my sister Mary Jane. So she's up to Timmins for her first reporting job. And on one particularly filthy day, terrible visibility, sleet, rain, everything nasty you can imagine about Northern Ontario, she set out to cover an accident. And so Mary Jane's a little unsure of herself, and she's there on the scene. And what's happened is that a driver, with poor visibility, a driver has driven right into a moose crossing the highway. Now, these are big animals, and he's practically totaled the car. But the moose these are massive creatures. The moose just sort of shook it off and limped off across the highway and back into the woods. So Mary Jane's interviewing the driver, and at one point she approaches the OPP officer on the scene. Now, every cop in Timmins knows that if they're talking to a reporter from the Free Press, the odds are they're talking to a rookie reporter. So Mary Jane's a little unsure of herself, and at one point she says to the cop, "So normally in a situation like this, would there be charges?" And the cop looks at her and deadpan says, "Yep, the moose killed everything." And I thought of that when I was doing the research on keeping the peace, my police history, when I saw the list of responsibilities that were given to Edward Proctor, who was really Sarnia's first police officer back in 1857, although in those days they called them street inspectors. And number 8 on the list was to ensure that no stallion is put to mare on any public street in the town. And I thought, it's true. Policing was a lot tougher in the old days. So back when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my Aunt Mary lived on Julia Street. Now, Julia Street was a little street that ran into the northern side of what was then called Victoria Park. And I think it's changed a lot. But she had a big old house. It was one of about 3 houses on the block. And immediately to the north of that house was a paved alley that ran through to Christina Street. And like I say, I'm 5 or 6, and I can remember her saying to me, right at the end of that alley, that's where that Red Ryan gangster got into that gunfight on Christina Street back in the 30s. Now, at the time, she was 19 years old and living in Point Edward, so you can understand why, as it turned out, she was off by about a block. But she felt invested in that story of Red Ryan. And later, I can remember my father, when I was a teenager, telling me this incredible story of him as a 14-year-old boy lining up with 6,000 other people in Sarnia to wind their way through Philip's funeral home to view the bullet-ridden bodies of Red Ryan and Harry Checkley, both laid out on undertakers' cots in the funeral home with a sheet drawn up to their waist so their wounds were visible. I thought it was some kind of early type of crime prevention. That they let people came from London, from Port Huron, to see these bodies. Now, you have to understand that the death of Jack Lewis, Constable Jack Lewis, who was murdered by Red Ryan during that botched holdup in the city's only liquor store back in 1936. It was the first shared example of mass grief in this community. It felt like somebody in your own family had been killed. And what made it worse was that anybody who knew anything about Red Ryan knew that he never should have been allowed to have been here on that Victoria Day weekend in 1936. Ryan was born in 1895 in Chicago. He moved to Toronto as a toddler. And by the time he was 10 years old, he was running his own street gang in Toronto. You know, shoplifting, getting into all sorts of hellery. And I won't go through the whole litany of his life, but suffice it to say that by the time he was put into prison for the last time, he had acquired sentences totaling 119 years in prison, plus a life sentence. But he, you know, they said he could con the birds out of the trees. He broke out, it was a sensational breakout of Kingston Penitentiary in 1923. He broke out with 5 other members of the gang he'd assembled in jail. He managed to cross the St. Clair River and for months raised hell all over the American Midwest until he was finally captured, put back into prison, back into Kingston Penitentiary. And then he did something remarkable. He started to talk to the prison chaplain and to the prison warden about what a waste he'd made of his life. And he said, if he ever had another chance to do it all over, I think the quote was, he would throw off his life of crime like a set of dirty rags. He used to sit in his cell carving statues of the Virgin Mary out of bars of soap. And when there was a riot in the prison, he refused to take part. And he's trying to convert all of the other prisoners to this new type of reformed convict. And he was fortunate enough to have a pal who worked for the Toronto Star. The Toronto Star bears some of the responsibility for what happened here on Victoria Weekend in 1936. And this guy's churning out stories about this poor reformed convict who's turned his life around and he's still being held behind bars. And isn't it a shame? And why can't he be let out? So he wrote so many stories about Red Ryan that by 1935, everybody in Toronto knows who he is. So it just happened. There was a federal election in 1935 that drew a campaign. And one of the election issues in a federal election was Ontario prison reform. And so Premier Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, and his Justice Minister paid a surprise visit one summer day to Kingston Penitentiary. And in the course of the visit, they met Red Ryan and spent 45 minutes with him. And Ryan charmed the Prime Minister. And so later on, when Ryan applied for a ticket of leave because his sister was compassionate leave, his sister was deadly ill, he was let out of prison and he basically never went back. And he is showered, this is, still during the Depression, 1936, he's showered with job offers in Toronto. Believe it or not, CFRB actually gave him his own radio program. And he's on the radio talking about what a waste he's made of his life. And, young boys, don't follow my path. And at the same time, he's put together quietly his own little gang, and he's robbing banks and businesses all across Ontario. And that's what brought him to Sarnia. Now, 2 months before he came to Sarnia, in May of 1936, he tried to steal a high-powered getaway car from a new car dealer in what was then the town of Markham. And in the course of another botched robbery, he managed to kill Edwin Stonehouse, who was the owner of this dealership. And so the province put out a $1,000 reward for the capture of whoever was responsible. Now, some of the cops in Toronto thought Ryan might have something to do with this, but it's hard to go and collar the guy when he's out having lunch with your boss. So that reward was applied for after what happened here on Victoria Weekend. That reward was applied for by the Sarnia police. And they made it clear that what they intended to do with the money was give it to Vera Hardick Lewis, Jack Lewis's widow, who wound up having to spend the rest of her life working in a factory to support her 2 young children. Now, of course, the province said, well, you guys are a police force, that's your job. We're not going to pay you the reward money. And that's where it stood until 2018. And our ability to actually achieve one of our goals. Now, when Laura Greaves and I and Ron Real Smith got involved with what had been a dormant historical society back in 2015, we had two primary goals. One was to create an online presence, and we succeeded in that. If you go to sarniahistoricalsociety.com, you will find up to 1,000 stories about Sarnia, written by various journalists, taken from books, magazines, on every subject you can imagine. And we launched the website in 2015 together with Special Insert in the Sarnia Journal, which became our history partner. They put out a special insert called Then and Now with 22 never before published history stories on Sarnia's past. So that was our first goal, and it was achieved. The second one was to do what had never been done in this city, and that was to create a public memorial to that slain officer, Sarnia's first police fatality, Constable Jack Lewis. And we seized the opportunity of another provincial election to do it back in 2018. So Ron, our president at the time, says, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go to the province and we're gonna apply for that reward. And we're gonna tell the province that we're gonna use the money to create a public memorial to Jack Lewis. Let's see them turn us down. And he's feeding all this stuff to the press, which eat it up. Now, as I knew they would, the province turned us down. But it was the way they did it that made news, because they came back and said, well, you know, normally we pay a reward for the arrest and conviction of a criminal. In this case, the Sarnia police gunned this guy down. And we said, well, of course they gunned him down. They were under fire at the time. Are you saying that this guy who was sentenced to 119 years in prison plus a life sentence didn't get his day in court? In any event, they turned us down, as we knew they would. And that hit the papers as well. And the day that story came out, something remarkable happened. We were in the middle of a board meeting, and we started getting phone calls. I think this is ridiculous. I want to contribute to that. I want to contribute to that memorial plaque. Call after call after call. And by the time our meeting was over, we'd raised the $5,000 that we needed to build that public memorial. And so we did it on a day in September in 2018, on a plaque affixed to the very building where Jack Lewis was killed and Red Ryan met his demise. And we were hoping to get 15 or 20 members of the Lewis family to come out for it. We were astonished when 130 members of the Lewis family showed up for this plaque unveiling. So both of our early goals then were achieved.
Well,
Yeah, thanks, honey. That's my timekeeper. She's not heckling me. So that is the keystone story in keeping the peace. It's the most important event in the history of the Sarnia Police, but we have others. How many, I'm going to ask for a show of hands even though I can't see them. How many know that there's a woman buried under the parking lot of Wag's restaurant?
yeah, most of them.
Oh, you know the story of Elizabeth Workman. So sadly, in 1872, most of the people in Sarnia were not Unitarians, or maybe they'd have had a little more, understanding of the diversity of the population. Poor Elizabeth Workman was married to a drunk, abusive husband. But what really did her in was the fact that she worked for a black barber. And so it's a very interesting story because the prejudice that existed in Sarnia, I mean, George, I can't think of his name, the publisher of the Globe, said that he thought the prejudice against blacks was worse here in Canada than it was in the United States. But we tell this whole story of Elizabeth Workman. It's a really intriguing story that prejudice reaches up to the Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald. We also tell the story of the Labatt kidnapping, which was the first major kidnapping in Canadian history. It happened right here at what was then called Sarnia Beach, which was Brights Grove. Before that, it was an American crime. It was considered an American crime. They called it the snatch and grab racket. That's what the police called kidnapping. There had been a kidnapping in 1874 in the United States, which was the first. And then, of course, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping in 1932. And that was really it for that crime until this attempt to kidnap John Labatt, which turned into a real comedy of errors. The old problem of how do you collect the ransom. You know, the kidnappers are calling into the Royal York, where there's like hundreds of reporters and police officers waiting to hear from these guys. And, you know, they're told to take the ransom money to the Humber River. And, you know, Labatt's brother says, "Are you kidding? Like, I'll have hundreds of people following me." But it's an interesting story if you don't know it. And then finally, we tell the story of the, I won't say finally, one of the other key stories is the story of the polymer explosion in 1951. The height of the Red Scare, half the population of the city flees because they think Sarnia's been hit by an atomic bomb. The rest all rush down to the Chemical Valley, clogging all the roads so that none of the emergency vehicles could get through. So this was the birth of emergency planning in the city of Sarnia, and also the birth of the Sarnia Police Traffic Department. Anyway, I had a lot of fun researching the book. It took me a couple of years. It's available. If you don't want to buy it at the bookkeeper, you can get it through the Sarnia Library. It's called Keeping the Peace, 160 Years of Policing the Imperial City. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you this morning. Thanks very much for your attention.